Before we start, I want you to understand something. This story does not fall apart all at once. It unravels quietly through small decisions that seem harmless until they are not. Because one email, one call, one denial changed everything in once. The first move was made. The clock started ticking. And what followed was not chaos but a pattern, and by the end of this video, you will see how control slipped, how narratives flipped, and why the moment they said nothing was the moment everything exploded. This story does not start where most people think it does, and that is intentional, because confusion is often the loudest weapon in any media storm, and what you are about to hear is not rumor, not speculation, but a slow unraveling of how a single decision triggered a chain reaction that spiraled completely out of control. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it, and that is why it matters that we start here with a seemingly harmless moment, an offhand interaction, a question about a mark on a face, a misunderstanding that feels light, almost funny at first, because that is how chaos often introduces itself, quietly, casually disguised as nothing important at all. And that same energy follows everything that comes next. Because while everyone was focused on surface-level distractions, something far more serious was unfolding behind the scenes through emails, texts, phone calls, and strategic silence. And this is where the real story begins, because while public narratives were being shaped one way, private communications were telling a very different story, and the gap between those two realities is where the tension lives and grows and eventually explodes. And what is so unsettling about this timeline is how fast it accelerates from internal coordination to outright panic, and once the first outreach happens, everything shifts. Because suddenly multiple parties believe they are in control while simultaneously accusing everyone else of acting out of turn. And that is when the confusion becomes deliberate and the denials start stacking on top of admissions, and you can feel the ground starting to move beneath everyone involved. Because the moment a media outlet makes contact, the stakes change instantly. And there is no undo button. And that is why every single text message matters here, because they document not just actions but reactions and contradictions, and the tension between authority and defiance. And as you follow this sequence, you begin to notice something unsettling that repeats over and over again. Instructions are given clearly: stop, do not engage, stand down, and yet engagement happens anyway, sometimes subtly, sometimes indirectly, sometimes followed immediately by claims that it never happened at all. And that contradiction is the heartbeat of this entire saga, because 1 minute there is an acknowledgement of outreach, an admission of contact, a casual statement that this is just part of the job, and the next minute there is a complete reversal, an insistence that nothing was said, nothing was done, and that someone else must be responsible. And this is where the suspense tightens, because the receipts do not disappear simply because someone wishes they would, and every attempt to distance from the moment only creates more questions, and the pressure intensifies when third parties begin confirming what was supposedly never said, because now the narrative is no longer internal, it is bouncing between studios, teams, representatives, and outlets. And that is when fear enters the chat, because fear is what drives overcorrection, and overcorrection is what leaves fingerprints everywhere. And you can see it in the urgency of the messages, the repetition of denials, the fixation on names being mentioned or not mentioned, the obsession with who said what to whom and when, and that obsession is not accidental. It is the behavior of someone who understands that once a version of events escapes containment, it cannot be recalled, and the attempt to regain control becomes frantic and messy. And that is exactly what we are watching unfold here in real time. Because the timeline does not pause for coordination, it keeps moving, and every hour that passes adds another layer of complexity, another inquiry, another outlet, another potential escalation. And that is when alliances start to strain, because when one team believes another team is freelancing, the trust fractures, and suddenly everyone is protecting themselves first, and the original goal, protecting the project, protecting the people, protecting the narrative, becomes secondary to protecting reputations. And that shift is critical because it marks the moment where damage control replaces strategy, and once that happens, every move becomes reactive, and reaction is never clean. And you can feel that in the language being used: confusion, frustration, disbelief, commands being repeated more forcefully because they are not being followed, and that repetition itself tells a story, because people who feel heard do not need to repeat themselves. And as this unfolds, the focus narrows to one central question: who made the first move, and why? Because that first move determines responsibility, and responsibility determines fallout. And this is where the looping tension comes in, because just when it seems like clarity is about to emerge, Another message drops that reframes everything and pulls the viewer back in because now there is a new detail, a new confirmation, a new contradiction, and the cycle restarts. And this is not accidental storytelling, this is real-time crisis unfolding, and the reason it keeps viewers locked in is because the truth is being revealed sideways, not in a straight line but through fragments and reactions and emotional spikes, and the deeper you go the clearer it becomes that this was never about one email or one call. It was about control over the story and control over the perception, and once that control slipped even briefly, the response was not to slow down but to speed up. And that is where things begin to spiral, because speed without alignment leads to mistakes, and mistakes leave trails, and those trails are what we are following now. And as you continue watching, you start to realize that the most telling moments are not the loud ones but the quiet ones, the pauses, the delays, the sudden insistence on rules that were already broken, and the defensive framing that appears only after consequences become visible. And that is why this matters, because what looks like chaos from the outside is actually a pattern on the inside, a pattern of escalation, denial, confirmation, and deflection repeating over and over again. And once you recognize that pattern, you can predict what comes next, and what comes next is where everything truly ignites, because this was only the spark and the moment. The decision was made not to publicly de-escalate, but instead to privately maneuver the gloves, metaphorically speaking. We're already coming off, and the people involved may not have realized it yet, but the tone had shifted, the clock had started, and the media cycle was no longer something to manage quietly. It was about to become the battlefield itself, and that is exactly where we are heading next. And you do not want to miss how that transition happens, because it is subtle until it is suddenly impossible to ignore. What happens next is where everything stops being messy and starts becoming dangerous, not in the dramatic sense people like to throw around, but in the very real sense of reputations, timelines, and credibility colliding. Because once the initial confusion gives way to confirmation, the atmosphere shifts entirely, and the tone of the communications tells you everything you need to know, because this is no longer about reminding people of protocol. It is about containment, and once containment becomes the goal, every message is weighed, every word is scrutinized, and every denial carries more weight than the last. And that is why the back and forth becomes so intense so fast, because multiple parties are now hearing the same thing from different sources. And when independent confirmations start lining up, the margin for plausible confusion disappears, and you can see the stress leaking through in the repetition of statements that contradict earlier acknowledgments, because when someone feels cornered, they do not slow down, they double down. And that is exactly what unfolds here, with insistence layered on top of insistence, and disbelief expressed not as curiosity but as accusation. And that is an important distinction, because disbelief can be investigative or it can be defensive, and this was clearly the latter. And the reason that matters is because the behavior shifts from cooperative to combative, and once that happens, internal alignment breaks down completely, and the group splinters into people trying to stop the bleeding and people trying to rewrite the timeline. And that is when credibility fractures, because while one side is focused on stabilizing external relationships, the other is focused on clearing a name internally, and those two goals are not the same, and they pull in opposite directions. And that tension becomes unbearable when outside entities begin reacting, because now the situation is no longer theoretical, it is producing consequences. And you can feel the panic spike when outlets are mentioned by name, when reactions from other teams are referenced, when phrases like heat, backlash, escalation start appearing, because those are not abstract concepts, those are signals that the narrative has escaped. And once a narrative escapes, it does not wait for permission to grow, and this is where the looping effect tightens, because every attempt to deny contact triggers another confirmation from someone else, and every attempt to point elsewhere brings the focus right back. And it becomes clear that the real issue is not whether a single call or email happened, but that the response to being questioned about it is far more damaging than the act itself, because transparency could have stopped the spiral, but defensiveness accelerates it, and that acceleration is what leads to the next phase, where silence is no longer an option and statements are no longer preventative but reactive, and the pressure intensifies when the refusal to publicly intervene creates a vacuum, and vacuums in media are always filled by someone, and in this case they were filled quickly and aggressively. And that is where the shift becomes unmistakable, because the moment the decision is made not to de-escalate, Publicly, the strategy pivots from wait and see to act, and the speed of that pivot is what shocks everyone involved, because less than a full day passes between restraint and full-scale narrative placement, and that speed tells you this was not improvisation, it was readiness, because you do not move that fast unless the pieces are already in place, and this is where the story takes a darker turn, not because of any single allegation, but because of the coordinated nature of what follows. And you see it in the pattern: multiple outlets, similar framing, synchronized timing, and an emphasis on implication rather than statement, and that is a classic tactic because implication travels faster than fact, and once those implications hit the trade cycle, they create momentum, and momentum becomes its own justification, and suddenly, the conversation is no longer about what actually happened, but about what it looks like happened, and that is far harder to reverse, and the tension spikes again when internal communications reveal awareness of this dynamic, because now there is fear not just of the story, but of how it will be used and by whom, and that fear manifests as frustration, anger, disbelief, and resignation all at once, and the language shifts again, becoming more emotional, less measured, because the realization sets in that this is no longer a contained situation, it is a rolling narrative, and the question is no longer, how did this start, but how far will it go? And that is where viewers lean in, because at this stage, the dominoes are no longer hypothetical. They are actively falling, and each one triggers the next, and the suspense comes from knowing that once a campaign like this gains traction, stopping it requires either overwhelming transparency or overwhelming power, and neither is easy to deploy once the cycle has begun, and that realization hangs over every subsequent message, every reaction, every attempt to frame the next move, and it is impossible not to feel that something fundamental has shifted, because the language of cooperation has vanished, replaced by the language of survival, and that is the moment everything truly changes, because when survival becomes the priority, strategy becomes secondary, and truth becomes negotiable, and that is the point of no return, and it is exactly where the story now finds itself, heading straight into the most explosive phase yet, which is what comes next. And when you step back and look at the full timeline, what becomes impossible to ignore is that this was never about one message or one misunderstanding, it was about control. And once that control slipped, the response was not to slow down but to escalate, and that escalation left a trail that cannot be walked back, because actions speak louder than denials and patterns speak louder than statements, and the reason this matters is because once narratives are weaponized, they do not stop on their own, they only stop when the truth catches up, and that is exactly where the story is headed next.